Picture this. A small wooden display case, shattered glass scattered across hardwood floors like fallen stars. The morning sunlight glints off empty hooks where medals once hung. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons, each representing sacrifice beyond measure. Frank Miller, 72 years old with weather-worn hands and eyes that have seen too much, kneels beside the wreckage, fingers trembling as they hover over jagged glass and empty space. His breathing comes in short, shallow bursts, a man drowning in his own living room. "They're just medals," says the responding officer, clicking his pen against his notepad. "Insurance should cover any monetary value." Frank doesn't respond. How do you explain that these weren't just medals? They were pieces of his soul, fragments of memory, nightmares and heroism pressed into metal and ribbon. The officer shifts uncomfortably in the silence, scribbling notes without understanding. In the doorway, Frank's neighbor Diane watches, phone clutched in white-knuckled hands. Her eyes dart between Frank and the front door left splintered from the break-in. Across the street, figures gather on porches, curious about the patrol car. In their quiet neighborhood, they whisper behind hands and smartphone screens, sharing theories and concern. None approach. None offer help. Frank's shoulders slump forward, decades of military bearing momentarily forgotten under this new, unexpected weight. His voice, when he finally speaks, carries the resignation of a man who has seen the worst of humanity and somehow still managed to be surprised by it. "I guess this is just how things are now." Little did he know that in this moment of profound loss, wheels were already turning. A community about to remember what it means to stand together, to honor sacrifice, and to right a wrong that cut deeper than any thief could have known. A story of betrayal and redemption was about to unfold in this sleepy town, one that would remind everyone of the power of respect, gratitude, and the unbreakable bonds formed in battle and in peace. Let me take you back to where it all began. Frank Miller moved to Lakeside Grove after 40 years of military and civil service, 3 decades in the Army, including 2 tours in Vietnam, and later service in Desert Storm, followed by 15 years working for the VA helping fellow veterans navigate the system he knew too well. Retirement wasn't something Frank had planned. Serving others had been his entire life. But his doctors insisted his heart couldn't take the stress anymore. The modest rancher on Oakwood Drive represented his reluctant compromise with mortality. Single story for when his knees finally gave out. Close to the VA hospital, quiet neighborhood with other retirees. A small workshop in the garage where he could keep his hands busy when the memories got too loud at night. What made Frank stand out wasn't his military bearing, though 40 years had made it impossible for him to slouch, or the precision with which he maintained his property. It was his patience. The neighborhood children learned quickly that Frank would stop whatever he was doing to answer questions, fix broken bicycle chains, or listen to stories that their parents were too busy to hear. He never raised his voice, never seemed rushed. Every interaction mattered to Frank. "Time is the only true currency," he would tell them, "and I'm retired. I'm rich in time now." In his living room, displayed with care but not ostentation, hung his medals and commendations. Frank never spoke about them, even when neighborhood kids asked with wide-eyed curiosity. "Just reminders," he'd say, changing the subject. But on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, he would stand before them, silent, remembering faces of men who never made it home to earn their own retirements, their own quiet houses on peaceful streets. The neighborhood watched with respectful distance, as Frank established himself as a steady presence. He joined the neighborhood watch but declined leadership positions. He attended community cookouts with homemade cornbread but never stayed late. He helped elderly neighbors with home repairs, refusing payment beyond a cold lemonade shared in the shade. "Frank's the real deal," residents would tell newcomers. "Salt of the earth type you don't see much anymore." What Frank didn't know, couldn't have noticed through his humble focus on each day's small tasks, was that someone was watching his routines with different interest, cataloging his comings and goings, noting the twice-monthly visits to the VA hospital on Thursdays, observing the respectful way people treated the aging veteran, the small considerations and nods of appreciation he received at the local diner, the hardware store, the pharmacy. Someone who saw Frank's quiet dignity not as something to respect, but as something to resent. Their first interaction came on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. Frank was carefully planting new shrubs along his front walkway, a gift from Mrs. Townsend next door to thank him for fixing her leaking faucet. The methodical way he measured between each planting spoke to his patient precision. A sharp voice cut through his concentration. "Your dirt's getting on my driveway." Frank looked up, squinting against the sunlight to see a figure standing at the property line. Ryan Cooper, who had moved into the Patterson house 2 months earlier, mid-30s, perpetually dressed in expensive casual wear that seemed at odds with the modest neighborhood. Frank had tried to introduce himself when the moving trucks arrived, but had been waved off with a curt, "Busy now." Frank straightened slowly, knees protesting the movement. "I apologize for that. I'll clean it up when I'm finished here." "It's getting on my car tires," Ryan continued, gesturing to the black SUV in his driveway, easily 15 feet from the nearest dirt. "This is a respectable neighborhood. Some of us have image to maintain." Frank nodded, keeping his expression neutral, despite the unnecessary confrontation. "Like I said, I'll make sure it's all cleaned up. Would you like me to do that now?" Ryan's mouth tightened, perhaps disappointed by the reasonable response. "Just keep your mess to yourself. People around here work hard for what they have. We don't need it messed up." "Understood," Frank said simply, turning back to his planting. "I'm not sure you do," Ryan muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Things change. The old ways aren't always respected anymore." Frank's hands stilled momentarily over the earth, but he didn't respond or look up again. He continued his work with the same careful attention, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the fractional stiffening of his shoulders. Later, when Mrs. Townsend brought out iced tea and commented on the confrontation she'd witnessed from her window, Frank merely shrugged. "New neighbor still settling in," he said. "Change is hard on some folks. He's been here 2 months, Frank, and you're the third neighbor he's picked some petty fight with." Frank smiled slightly. "Then he's still settling in." Mrs. Townsend shook her head. "You military types. Always so diplomatic." "Not diplomatic," Frank corrected gently. "Strategic. Never engage in a battle not worth winning." The dirt was meticulously cleaned from the sidewalk and nearby concrete that evening. If Ryan Cooper noticed or appreciated the effort, he gave no indication. Instead, the following week saw the first of what would become a pattern of boundary violations and confrontations. It began with Ryan's landscapers blowing leaves and grass clippings onto Frank's freshly swept walkway. When Frank politely mentioned it, Ryan dismissed it as wind and suggested Frank not be so uptight about a few leaves. Then came the late-night parties that violated noise ordinances, with cars parked blocking partial access to Frank's driveway. When Frank walked over to request guests move their vehicles, Ryan loudly announced to his friends that the neighborhood watchdog is policing our fun again, and asked if Frank didn't have war memories to relive instead of bothering normal people. Frank took each incident in stride, documenting them in a small notebook, but seeking resolution through proper channels. He called non-emergency police lines about noise violations. He spoke with the HOA president about parking issues. He installed simple security cameras after finding his mailbox open and mail scattered one afternoon. "You need to stand up to bullies," insisted Marco Ramirez, Frank's friend from the VFW and a former Marine. "This punk wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes in basic." "This isn't the military," Frank reminded him, "and escalation rarely solves problems between neighbors." "He's counting on you being too decent to push back," Marco warned. "Some people see kindness as weakness." What Marco didn't understand, what few people could, was that Frank had seen true conflict. He'd witnessed the cost of escalation, how quickly situations spiraled beyond control. The weight of his medals, earned in moments where violence became necessary, reminded him daily of the value of peace, of measured responses, of choosing battles with care. So instead of confrontation, Frank installed additional lighting around his property. He arranged for a neighbor's teenage son to collect his mail when he had VA appointments. He documented each incident methodically, building a case should formal intervention become necessary. But Ryan Cooper seemed to view Frank's restraint as a challenge rather than wisdom. 3 months into their neighbor relationship, the incidents accelerated in both frequency and severity. Frank returned from grocery shopping to find Ryan and friends using his driveway to park a boat trailer, blocking access to his garage. "We'll move it later," Ryan called from his yard where a cookout was underway. "Don't make a federal case out of it, old man." When Frank called the non-emergency police line, the responding officer, Officer Diaz, who had taken 3 previous calls, arrived promptly. "Again, Mr. Cooper?" she said sharply as Ryan protested. "This is the 4th complaint this month. The next one comes with a formal citation." "For what?" Ryan demanded. "Using a little extra concrete?" "He wasn't even using the driveway when we parked here." "For trespassing and property violation," Officer Diaz replied, unimpressed. "Move the trailer now, please." As the officer supervised the relocation, she spoke quietly to Frank. "He's escalating. Mr. Miller, have you considered a restraining order?" Frank shook his head. "That would just inflame things. He's trying to provoke a reaction. And if he gets one, then he wins," Frank said simply. "I've been in real wars, officer. This isn't one." Officer Diaz studied the older man's face. "Your patience is admirable, sir, but there are limits to what you should tolerate. Everyone has a right to peaceful enjoyment of their property." Frank smiled slightly. "I'm aware. I spent 40 years protecting that right." After she left, Frank noticed Ryan watching from his porch, expression dark with something beyond mere neighborhood annoyance. Their eyes met briefly across the distance between properties, and Frank felt a chill of recognition. He had seen that look before, in distant places where resentment and opportunity bred dangerous outcomes. That night, Frank added motion-activated cameras to his security system. The footage they captured over the next weeks told a disturbing story. Ryan testing boundaries by walking through Frank's yard at night, examining window frames, checking door handles when he thought no one was watching. Small acts of vandalism. Garden hoses turned on and left running, potted plants overturned, garbage scattered, always when Frank was at his regular Thursday VA appointments. Frank compiled the evidence methodically, creating time-stamped logs and saving footage. He shared select incidents with Officer Diaz, who added them to a growing file. "This is becoming harassment, Mr. Miller," she advised. "We can act on this." "Not yet," Frank decided. "Let's see where this goes." What Frank didn't share, even with Officer Diaz, was his growing concern about Ryan's interest in his home's security. The way his gaze lingered on windows, the testing of locks, the escalating boldness of his trespassing. 40 years in service had taught Frank to recognize patterns of escalation, to sense when boundaries were being tested before a more significant breach. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, Frank deliberately broke his routine. He announced at the diner that morning that he was heading to his VA appointment early, would be gone all day for tests. Then he parked his car at Marco's house, walked back through the wooded area behind the neighborhood, and quietly entered his home through the back door. From his darkened bedroom window, Frank watched Ryan approach his front porch 3 hours later, glance around the quiet street, and then move to the side of the house, directly into the blind spot that existed between two security cameras. The weakness in coverage that Frank had intentionally left in place. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then Ryan reappeared, moving quickly back to his own property. He carried nothing, seemed to have done nothing, yet his expression held the satisfaction of mission accomplished. Frank inspected his property carefully, but found no damage, no entry, no vandalism. Just a strange circular scratch on his back window. The test mark of someone checking glass thickness, assessing vulnerability, someone planning a more significant violation. That evening, Frank made a show of returning home with his car, carrying VA paperwork, maintaining the illusion that he'd been gone all day. From his porch, Ryan watched, lifting his beer bottle in mock salute. Frank nodded pleasantly and went inside, where he immediately checked his display case of medals. All present, all undisturbed. That night, Frank called Marco. "I need a favor," he said quietly, "and I need you not to ask questions." 2 days later, Frank left for his actual VA appointment, making no secret of his departure time, and expected late return. The automated security system activated as he drove away, including the new cameras Marco had helped install the previous evening. Smaller, better concealed, covering all previous blind spots. What those cameras captured that afternoon would become neighborhood legend. Ryan Cooper, dressed in dark clothing despite the summer heat, approaching Frank's house with practiced casualness. The testing of windows. The discovery of the apparently vulnerable back window, pre-loosened by Frank himself. The careful removal of the window and entry into the house. Inside, additional cameras documented Ryan's methodical search through Frank's home, the targeted focus on his living room, the moment he discovered the display case of medals. The contemptuous expression as he examined each one, reading citations, testing weight in his palm. The careful packing of medals into a small bag brought specifically for this purpose. The footage captured with perfect clarity Ryan's startled reaction to a car door slamming outside, a neighbor arriving home early, and his hasty exit through the same window, taking with him 40 years of service and sacrifice reduced to medal and ribbon in a canvas bag. Frank returned home to the expected scene. Shattered display case, missing medals, apparent break-in. He made the appropriate calls, filed the necessary reports, played his role as victim with convincing distress. What he didn't share with responding officers was the complete security footage already backed up to multiple devices. What he didn't disclose was the knowledge that the primary crime had been captured in perfect detail from multiple angles. What he kept to himself was the plan already forming, a plan founded not on revenge, but on justice and education. A plan worthy of the strategic thinking that had earned some of those stolen medals. The next community meeting was scheduled 3 days after the break-in. Normally sparsely attended, this one saw record turnout as news of the theft spread through the neighborhood. Frank sat quietly in the back as neighbors expressed outrage, suggested increased security measures, proposed community fundraisers to replace the monetary value of the stolen items. Ryan Cooper sat near the front, occasionally offering sympathetic comments and suggestions for better home security systems. When the floor opened for community announcements, Frank stood. "I'd like to thank everyone for their concern about my recent loss," he began, voice steady. "It means a great deal to know this community cares about its members." Murmurs of support filled the room. Ryan nodded sympathetically from his seat. "I've been thinking a lot about what those medals represented," Frank continued. "Not their monetary value, which is minimal, but their meaning. Each was earned not just by me, but by the men and women who served alongside me, many of whom never came home." The room quieted, sensing the weight of his words. "I'd like to use this unfortunate incident as an opportunity for education. With the board's permission, I'd like to give a presentation at next month's meeting about the significance of military honors, what they represent, and the stories behind them." The board president nodded immediately. "I think that would be very valuable, Frank. Thank you." Frank paused, then added casually, "To help with this presentation, I've been in touch with several military contacts. One has generously offered to loan replacement medals identical to those taken, genuine honors from the same campaigns with the same citations. They'll be delivered next week." Ryan shifted slightly in his seat, expression carefully neutral. "Additionally," Frank continued, "given the targeted nature of this theft, I've installed an enhanced security system with multiple cameras. The Veterans Affairs Office has also offered to feature my home in a piece about protecting military memorabilia, which will include regular security checks by their staff." He smiled slightly, making direct eye contact with Ryan for the first time. "It seems this unfortunate event has created quite a bit of attention from various official organizations. Sometimes good comes from bad situations." The meeting continued, but keen observers noticed Ryan's increasing discomfort. The way he checked his watch repeatedly, his early departure. What no one knew was that Frank had made no calls to military contacts, had ordered no replacement medals, had arranged no VA features. What he had done was implement the next phase of a carefully orchestrated plan, one designed to make Ryan Cooper believe the stolen medals were about to become the most dangerous items in his possession. For the next 2 weeks, Frank maintained his routine with one significant addition. Each evening, he spent time with different neighbors, sharing genuine stories from his service for the first time. Not tales of heroism or combat, but stories of camaraderie, of shared hardship, of the bonds formed between those who served together. He brought photographs of young men in uniform, letters saved for decades, small mementos more valuable than any medal. He answered questions he'd previously deflected, explained the significance of different honors, helped children understand the meaning behind the symbols. These conversations spread through the community, changing the narrative from simple theft to profound disrespect. They transformed abstract outrage into personal investment. Meanwhile, Ryan Cooper grew increasingly agitated. Frank's security cameras captured his late-night observations of Frank's house, his visible reaction to the official-looking car that parked outside for an hour one afternoon, Marco's cousin, a city employee doing a personal favor, his growing paranoia as Frank's calculated comments about ongoing investigation and serial numbers recorded with the Department of Defense circulated through neighborhood gossip. 3 weeks after the theft, the trap was finally sprung. The community center was packed for Frank's presentation on military honors. A projector displayed photographs of different medals, their history, the criteria for earning each. Frank spoke with quiet authority about service and sacrifice, about the weight of memories each decoration carried. "The Purple Heart," Frank explained, displaying an image on screen, "is awarded to those wounded or killed in action. Mine was received after our unit was ambushed outside Kafji in 1991. He touched his side unconsciously. The medal itself is simply purple fabric and metal. Its value comes from what it represents, not glory or heroism, but sacrifice and survival when others didn't make it home." In the back of the room, Ryan Cooper stood against the wall, face pale and drawn. He had avoided Frank since the theft, but seemed unable to stay away from this event, drawn by the same impulse that makes criminals return to crime scenes. "The Bronze Star with Valor," Frank continued, showing another image, "is awarded for heroic achievement in combat operations. I received mine for actions that I've never considered heroic, just necessary in the moment to protect my fellow soldiers." He paused, looking out at the attentive faces. Each medal tells a story not just of one person, but of many, of teamwork, sacrifice, and the cost of freedom that most civilians never have to calculate. That's why they're displayed, not as trophies, but as reminders, as memorials to those who served alongside me but didn't return to receive their own honors. Ryan pushed away from the wall, moving toward the exit. Frank watched him go, then continued smoothly. "I've brought something special today," he said, lifting a small box onto the podium. "These are replacement medals, identical to those taken from my home, loaned by a fellow veteran for this presentation." He opened the box, revealing gleaming decorations against dark velvet. "What makes these particular replacements special," Frank continued, voice carrying clearly through the now silent room, "is that they belong to Marco Ramirez's brother, who served in my unit and was killed in action. The Bronze Star was awarded posthumously. His family has preserved them for 30 years as their last connection to their son and brother." From the front row, Marco nodded solemnly, playing his rehearsed role perfectly. "The theft of such items," Frank said, voice hardening slightly, "isn't just taking metal and ribbon. It's desecrating memory. It's dishonoring sacrifice. It's stealing the final testament of fallen soldiers whose families have nothing else to remember them by." He closed the box carefully, which is why the FBI has a special division dedicated to the theft of military honors, with enhanced penalties when those honors were awarded posthumously. This was a carefully constructed fiction. No such FBI division existed, but delivered with such conviction that an audible murmur spread through the room. "I've been informed," Frank continued, "that Agent Wilson will be in our community tomorrow to collect evidence and fingerprints. I understand several search warrants are pending approval." At the back of the room, the door closed with a bang as Ryan Cooper fled the building. Frank made eye contact with Officer Diaz, standing by the side door, who nodded once and slipped out. "Now," Frank said, returning to his presentation, "let me tell you about the history of the Combat Action Badge." The community sat transfixed, not just by the information but by the unfolding drama they sensed behind Frank's measured words. What they didn't see was Ryan Cooper racing home, frantic energy driving him to the hidden shoebox in his garage where he'd stored the stolen medals. What they didn't witness was his panicked disposal attempt, first in his own trash, then reconsidered and removed, then driven to a community dumpster 3 blocks away. What they couldn't know was that Officer Diaz, following at a discreet distance based on Frank's careful prediction of Ryan's likely response, documented the entire panic-driven journey with her patrol car's dash camera and body camera. By the time Frank's presentation concluded with a standing ovation, Ryan Cooper had been detained for questioning regarding suspicious activity. By the time community members finished thanking Frank for his service and his educational program, the stolen medals had been recovered from the dumpster, still in the canvas bag bearing Ryan's fingerprints, documented with chain of custody procedures that would make any evidence admissible in court. And by the time Frank arrived home, a crowd of neighbors had gathered on his front lawn around a patrol car where Ryan Cooper sat in the back seat, head in hands, as Officer Diaz carefully logged the recovered medals into evidence. "Mr. Miller," Officer Diaz called as Frank approached. "Perfect timing. Would you be willing to identify these items?" Frank examined the medals without touching them, nodding confirmation. "These appear to be mine, yes. And would you like to press charges for breaking and entering, theft, and property damage?" Frank looked at Ryan, seeing not triumph or satisfaction in the younger man's defeat, but the empty cost of pettiness and disrespect. He thought of actual battles fought, actual enemies faced, actual hatred confronted. "Yes," he said simply, "I would." Social media exploded with the story overnight. Community members who had witnessed the presentation shared details, embellishing the FBI involvement, celebrating the methodical trap Frank had laid. Local news picked up the story by morning, focusing on the veteran angle, the community support, the recovery of irreplaceable military honors. Ryan Cooper's reputation unraveled with remarkable speed. Neighbors came forward with their own stories of boundary violations, property damage, harassment. His employer, tagged repeatedly in social media posts about the incident, issued a statement, distancing themselves from the alleged actions of an employee and placing Ryan on leave pending investigation. The crowning blow came when 3 other veterans in neighboring communities reported similar thefts of military honors over the past year, cases previously unconnected but now drawing law enforcement attention as potentially related crimes. Frank watched the cascade of consequences with mixed emotions. He had sought justice, not destruction, education, not humiliation. As the story spiraled beyond his control, amplified by social media outrage and community catharsis, he found himself withdrawing from the narrative others were creating around him. When reporters requested interviews, he politely declined. When neighbors suggested a community celebration of the medal's return, he thanked them, but suggested a veterans' charity fundraiser instead. When online commenters demanded maximum prosecution and jail time, Frank remained silent, allowing the legal system to proceed without public pressure. 2 weeks after his arrest, Ryan Cooper appeared at Frank's door under the supervision of his attorney. His face was drawn, his designer clothes replaced by simple business casual attire, his demeanor stripped of its former arrogance. "Mr. Miller," he began formally, "I've come to apologize in person for my actions and to return this." He held out a small object, a campaign ribbon that had fallen from the bag during the theft, missed in the recovery. Frank accepted it without comment. "My attorney has arranged a plea deal with the prosecutor," Ryan continued, words clearly rehearsed but tone sincere. "I'll be paying full restitution for damages, performing 500 hours of community service at the Veterans Affairs Hospital, and I've listed my house for sale as I'll be relocating following the completion of my probation." Frank nodded, studying the younger man's face. "Why did you take them?" he asked simply. Ryan looked away, jaw working. "I don't have a good answer." "Resentment, entitlement. I saw how people respected you, deferred to you, how you never had to assert yourself to be heard. I wanted to take something that mattered. Did it give you what you wanted?" "No, sir," Ryan answered, the military address slipping out unconsciously. "It just showed me how small I've been." Frank extended his hand. "Then, something worthwhile came from all this." With formal charges filed but a plea agreement in place, the community's focus shifted from outrage to restoration. The broken display case was replaced by a local craftsman who refused payment for doing right by a veteran. The damaged window was repaired by a neighborhood work crew organized by Marco, turning the task into an impromptu cookout and community gathering. Most significantly, a local teacher arranged for her high school history class to interview Frank about his service, creating a permanent video record of his experiences and the stories behind each medal. The project expanded to include other veterans in the area, creating an archive of living history that would outlast any physical decorations. Frank found himself embraced by a community that had previously respected him from a distance. His quiet presence at neighborhood events transformed into active participation as he discovered the healing power of sharing long-held memories, of allowing others to understand the experiences that had shaped him. Ryan Cooper sold his house within a month, making brief appearances only to fulfill legal obligations and continue his mandated community service. He worked at the VA hospital with diligence if not enthusiasm, avoiding Frank's regular Thursday appointments by mutual agreement. On his final day in the neighborhood, Ryan stopped by one last time. "I wanted you to know," he said awkwardly, standing on the porch rather than entering, "that my service at the VA continues even after I move. By choice, not court order." Frank nodded, recognizing the significance of the voluntary commitment. "Working with those veterans," Ryan continued, "seeing what they've sacrificed, what they live with daily, it's changed how I see things." "That's good," Frank said simply. Ryan hesitated, then added, "One of the counselors there suggested I might have what they call toxic entitlement. It was a belief that respect is something you demand rather than earn." He shrugged self-consciously. "I'm working on it." "That's even better," Frank replied. They shook hands, not as friends but as men, acknowledging a significantly altered understanding between them. 1 year after the theft, Lakeside Grove celebrated its first annual Veterans Appreciation Day. The community center displayed photographs and stories from local veterans, collected through the high school history project that had begun with Frank. Children created thank you cards under the guidance of the same teacher who had initiated the oral history recordings. Local businesses offered discounts to veteran customers and their families. Frank, now serving on the neighborhood council despite his initial reluctance, found himself the center of a community that had transformed casual respect into genuine appreciation and understanding. "You've started something significant here," Marco told him as they watched families exploring the displays of military history. "All because you refused to just be a victim." Frank shook his head. "All because someone made a poor choice, and a community decided to create something better from it." The medals themselves, returned to their place of honor in a new handcrafted display case, remained important symbols. But Frank found they were no longer the primary repository of his memories and experiences. Those now lived in the recorded histories and the understanding of his neighbors, in the education of children who now recognized the cost behind the symbols. Reports occasionally filtered back about Ryan Cooper. He had completed his community service hours, but continued volunteering at the VA hospital in his new city. He had joined a community mediation program, helping resolve neighborhood disputes before they escalated. He had, it seemed, found a way to transform his own story from what could have been a defining mistake into something approaching redemption. Frank kept these updates largely to himself, believing that some journeys deserve privacy and that genuine change happens without audience or acclaim. In quiet moments, Frank still stood before his medals, remembering faces and moments from decades past. But now he also thought about how those small pieces of metal and ribbon had created unexpected connections in the present, building bridges between generations, between civilians and veterans, between past sacrifices and present understanding. Sometimes the most valuable things we possess are not the objects themselves, but the stories they tell and the connections they create. So now I'm asking you, have you ever witnessed a community come together to right a wrong? Have you seen justice served through wisdom rather than vengeance? Share your stories in the comments below. I'd love to hear how your community has stood up for its members when they needed support most. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of community, justice, and the unexpected ways people rise to challenges together. Remember, sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect isn't outrage. It's education and understanding. Until next time, remember that your community is only as strong as your willingness to stand together when it matters most.